Morning. Welcome to Republic Baptist Church's online Sunday school class. Today is August 8th, 2021. Today we're in the third session of the topic, Elijah, Living Outside the Comfort Zone. The title of today's lesson is Serve Through Prayer. The point of today's lesson is serve those around you through consistent prayer. The scripture for today's lesson comes from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 through 24. I will be reading from the CSB version. After this, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. His illness got worse until he stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "Man of God, what do you have against me? Have you come to call attention to my iniquity so that my son is put to death?" But Elijah said to her, "Give me your son." So he took him from her, brought him up to the upstairs room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, "Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow I am staying with by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times. He called out to the Lord and said, "Lord my God, please let this boy's life come into him again." So the Lord listened to Elijah, and the boy's life came to him again, and he lived. Then Elijah took the boy, brought him down from the upstairs room into the house, and gave him to his mother. Elijah said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know you are a man of God, and the Lord's word from your mouth is true." In 1984, 18-year-old Thomas Hainsworth was on an errand to buy sweet potatoes and bread from his mother. While running this errand, a victim of a recent sexual assault saw him and mistakenly identified him as her attacker. Thomas Hainsworth was wrongly convicted and spent 27 years of his life behind bars. Then, lawyers at the Innocent Project intervened using new discovered DNA testing to get his conviction overturned. On December 6, 2011, he was fully exonerated of all charges. Hainsworth is just one of many wrongly convicted prisoners now freed due to the work of the Innocent Project, started by lawyers Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld in 1992. They believed if DNA technology could prove that people were guilty of crimes, it could exonerate the innocent as well. Their passionate desire to intercede for those who cannot help themselves has grown into an international movement that has freed hundreds of innocent men and women. But you don't have to be an attorney to plead someone's case. Elijah intervened on behalf of the widow at Zarephath. Proves that we can change others' lives simply by praying. You're surely familiar with Murphy's Law that says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The British variation is Sod's Law, which means essentially the same thing, but also carries the notion of being mocked by fate. The poor, unlucky sod is an average person hounded by bad fortune. And then there's the addendum used with both laws, Finagle's Law. This law says anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and at the worst possible time. Ever felt like Murphy and Finagle were stalking you, and you were the unfortunate sod? First, the transmission goes out on your car. Then your home's air conditioner quits. And when you're almost finished paying for those two things, you get an expensive traffic ticket. Or in a more serious scenario, you lose your job. Then your marriage falls apart. And when you're finally getting back on your feet, you find out you have cancer. In times like these, we can relate to the widow at Zarephath. First, she had lost her husband. Widows at that time had little means of income. So after the initial blow, a drought came, and resources started to dwindle for her and her son. She became more and more poor until she had only enough flour and oil for one final meal. She resigned herself to death by starvation. She expected the unexpected appearance of Elijah on her doorstep brought relief in the form of renewed food resources. But just when it seemed things were returning to normal, life came crashing down again. The widow's son became sick, extremely sick, and then she experienced a horrific moment when her son stopped breathing, and life left his body. I know the sheer terror of this feeling. In 2013, my husband and I received a phone call from the hospital. Your son, code blue, found unresponsive. Come immediately. We watched helpless as doctors and nurses worked on his lifeless body, assessing his vitals and searching for brain activity. Such moment raised myriad unanswerable questions. Why? Why me? Why my child? Why now? In her shock and despair, the widow turned on Elijah. She asked similar questions. Man of God, what do you have against me? Have you come to call attention to my iniquity so that my son is put to death? She wondered if her son's death was the result of her own sin, and Elijah had been sent to bring her punishment. People in ancient times commonly viewed sickness as God's punishment for sin, as we see in John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. As he was passing by, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Yet Elijah had already spared her son from death once by miraculously extending their food resources. The more pertinent question would have been, why did God bring my son through the last crisis only to let him die of another? Not even the wisest believers have an easy answer for much of the suffering that we endure. It's not always given to us to know why. Even Elijah questioned God at this turn of events. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 20 read, Then he cried out unto the Lord and said, Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow I am staying with by killing her son? The why of suffering is not always clear. C.S. Lewis wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is the megaphone to rouse a deaf world. We may not know the reasons why, but suffering shouts for us to look to God. Similarly, God had something to say to the widow at Zarephath. He wanted to show her something about herself. She would soon learn to know that God, she would soon learn to know God as her deliverer. Her deepest suffering was an opportunity to trust God and witness His power. When it seems all is lost, we are perfectly positioned to turn to God and discover He is the answer to the questions that have no other answer. How does the widow demonstrate common responses to tragedies? We all ask why, don't we? We all don't understand. So we have questions. So we're going to respond just like she did. Because in not knowing, we've got to ask. We can always find reasons to stay out of other people's problems. Sometimes people take advantage of us. Sometimes we don't have the resources to fix what's broken. Their problems may seem too big, or their troubles too deep. Quite often we have enough problems of our own. Elijah certainly did. He had angered Ahab and Jezebel and had surely troubled a lot of his neighbors by bringing drought. In spite of all he was facing, Elijah stepped into the widow's suffering and joined her in her pain. While he could do nothing in his own power to restore her loss, Elijah knew the God who does the impossible. Luke chapter 1 verse 37 reads, "For nothing will be impossible with God." So the prophet took it upon him. So the prophet took it up with him. I love Elijah's honesty and humility in this moment. Although the widow had just accused him of bringing this trouble, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't pretend to know the answer to her question. Elijah simply took the widow's problem and made it his own. He carried the lifeless boy to his room, laid him on his own bed. He got involved in the messiness of the widow's troubled life. And then Elijah did the only thing he knew to do under the circumstances. He prayed. Elijah's prayer is a picture of real faith. Real faith doesn't presume to know why God does what he does or why he allows what he allows. Real faith asks the hard questions. It voices doubts and anguish we feel. Yet, despite the questions, doubts, and hurt, real faith comes back. Real faith keeps coming back to God. It trusts that whatever happens, He is all-loving, all-powerful. It trusts that God is the answer to our every need. In crying out to God, Elijah spoke up for the widow. He raised the question that plagued her. He pleaded for the help she needed. He demonstrated the only two things needed to be a great prayer. He demonstrated the only two things needed to be a great prayer warrior: compassion for someone in need and faith that God could help. We call this intercessory prayer. An intercessor is a go-between, someone who mediates between two parties. And when we intercede for others in prayer, we are going to God on behalf of others. We should feel honored when someone goes before the throne of God on our behalf, presenting our need. At the same time, we have the privilege of going before God with the needs of others. Paul called us to this. I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for everyone. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. Even more, we should consider it our responsibility. Elijah lived that principle. He didn't rationalize that this boy was not his child. Therefore, praying for the boy was not his responsibility. He followed the example of Samuel, who, in his last public address, told the Israelites, "As for me, I vow I will not sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you." That's in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23. The believer is called to a life of service, and that service includes praying for others. For a believer, to know others are suffering is to bear the responsibility and privilege of praying for them. Elijah is an example of an effective prayer. The prayer of a righteous person is very powerful in its effect. Elijah was a human being as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the land. Then he prayed again, and the sky gave rain, and the land produced its fruits. That's from James chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. Elijah was a human being as we are. He possessed no miraculous powers in himself. He had no greater authority with God than we do. But he believed God could do anything, and he dared to ask God for the impossible. Lord, my God, please let this boy's life come into him again. What holds us back from expressing our emotions, fears, and pain before God in prayer? God is not a divine Santa Claus who grants our every wish. God is not beholden to do our bidding just as we ask. but he invites us to participate with him in helping others. He encourages us to intercede on their behalf, and he moves to respond to the prayers of his people. God responded to Abraham's pleas to spare his nephew Lot from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. You can see that in Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 through 33, and chapter 19, verses 12 through 22. God relented from destroying the children of Israel after Moses interceded on their behalf. Exodus chapter 32, verses 9 through 14. And God resurrected Dorcas when Peter prayed over her corpse. Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. In response to the fervent prayer of believers, God sent an angel to rescue Peter from jail on the night before he was to be tried. Acts chapter 12, verses 3 through 12. God still acts in response to prayers of his people. Well, I remember those days in the hospital with my son when we did not know if he would survive. Friends and family supported us with love and prayed for us and prayed with us for our child. When our son walked out of that hospital days later, it was a testimony to God's work, the power of prayer. 7 years after, he is healthy and strong. His very presence is a continual reminder of God's mercy and the compassion of friends brought together in prayer. I do not imagine it was any goodness in my family or me that prompted God to act, nor do I suppose our prayers were more persuasive than others. I don't know why every prayer doesn't receive the answer we seek. I don't believe God spared my son to end my suffering. Often God's yes is aimed at a higher purpose. Through his response to our prayer, he reveals something of his nature that fosters our faith. We see that Elijah presented the widow with her revived child and declared, "Look, your son is alive." Her first words were, "Now I know." At last she knew God is real, and Elijah was his spokesperson. It was not just her son who came to life. Faith also came to life in the widow through Elijah's answered prayer. Living in a culture of Baal worshippers, the widow awakened to the truth. Yahweh alone is the true and faithful God. Perhaps more people around us would come to faith if we, like Elijah, dared to ask God for the impossible. Bold prayers honor God, and God honors bold prayers. God isn't offended by our biggest dreams or our boldest prayers. He is offended by anything less. If your prayers aren't impossible to you, they are insulting to God. When we pray, God responds, and when God responds, it points to him. When Jesus' disciples asked him whether a man had been born blind due to his own sins or that of his parents, Jesus answered, "Neither. This came about so that God's work might be displayed in him." John chapter 9, verses 2 through 3. May others see God as we pray. And I would like to interject something in today's lesson that happened in my life and my family's life that has affected us tremendously. In August of 2010, my son's first child was born. And he lived only 12 days. And in those 12 days, we prayed and prayed and prayed. We went to the chapel at the hospital every day. And we stayed at the hospital praying to God, praying that he would spare my grandson's life. And on September the 10th, my grandson went on to be with the Lord. He took my son on to be with him. And the why questions came. Why did my son's first son have to die? But as we prayed, we never gave up hope. We had hope. But to see the things that came from this makes me know that God's purpose was in it. And he doesn't always give us a positive answer in the way that we see positive. But even though Weston died, there was a positive that came from it. Because there was a lady that my son worked with, and she had said, or after the funeral, she said that she had drifted away from the Lord and she didn't have anything to do with the Lord, but she watched us through those 12 days of going to the chapel and praying and putting our hope and trust in the Lord, and how when Weston died, our faith did not wane. We did not turn away from God as she did. And therefore, because of Weston's few days here on earth, she turned back to God. So if it was for that one person turning back to God, that was Weston's purpose here on earth, then it was all worth it. So you see, we have to look for God's purpose in the bad things that happen to us, or we feel that they're bad things, but for God, all things work to good to those who love the Lord. So I'll get off of my interjection and get back to the lesson. When have you seen answered prayer point others to God? Well, this was a answered prayer that we thought was unanswered that turned this lady back to God. Elijah acted out of his compassion for the widow and her son. Elijah got involved. What reasons do you sometimes use to justify your unwillingness to get involved in the lives of others? How can Elijah's example help you improve your service to others? Ask God to empower you to serve and intercede on the behalf of others. The Innocent Project, as we talked about in the beginning of this lesson, has interceded for innocent prisoners who served a combined total of over 5,000 years in prison. Lives have been restored and families have been reunited. When we intercede for others in prayer, we can likewise join with God in restoring lives and leading people to Christ. How will you step into the lives of others by praying for them? Well, first we must pray. Pray right now for someone you know who is in need physically or spiritually. Trust God to answer. And journal. Begin a prayer journal to list the needs of others. Use it in your daily quiet time and update it with answers God provides. And pray with others. Start a prayer group at your church or with your neighbors. Invite others to pray with you for the needs in your community and around the world. And I have a special prayer request that I've been praying for, and I believe God will answer the prayer. Well, I know God will answer the prayer in His way. But I pray for a special person who is suffering from COVID right now and has been put on a ventilator. And the doctor says this person only has a 10% chance of making it. But I still believe in miracles, and I believe God will do what is best in this person's life. I pray that this person would be healed completely. And I'm asking you to join me in praying for this person who cannot pray for themselves. This is a way we can intercede for them. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you'll join me again next week. Thank you.